This guy sounds like a complete fraud. I really have no idea how that person got into that position. They sound like a complete idiot. If they listen to that person, they are going to 100% make some horrifically bad decisions. In any professional career, you will from time to time hear opinions like these expressed about other individuals, and it really points to a fundamental aspect of a career, which is that your ability to be successful, network, collaborate, will depend in part on you being able to form informed opinions of those around you. Now, there are two extremes here. One is you can be that sort of person who is inherently extremely positive all of the time, very trusting, very respectful of everyone around you, and has complete faith in the ability of everyone to do a fantastic job. At the other end, the other extreme, is someone who is just inherently always cynical, always skeptical, always pessimistic about the ability of someone else to do something. But of course, the reality is that most people will and should be somewhere in the middle of these two extremes. In this video, I want to cover some key concepts and insights relating to the scenario portrayed in the opening of this video, where a peer or a colleague expresses extreme skepticism or doubt, or basically accuses someone around them of being an outright fraud. In terms of context for this video, I won't be covering outright blatant psychos, and luckily there aren't too many of those. Obviously, I won't be covering individuals who are perhaps going through some sort of mental health crisis as well, which can sometimes result in these sort of behaviors and perspectives from other people around them. So they're off limits for today's video. And before someone accuses me of projecting, of course, I've had my fair share of experiences and frustrations with some individuals, but mostly this is sharing insights and perspectives on the thousands of colleagues I've worked with and interacted with when these sort of perceptions have come up periodically. So the first thing is the whole play the ball, not the person concept. So in the vast majority of cases, the individual that's being questioned or accused of being a fake or a fraud has plenty of useful things to offer. The real question is whether that individual, then the way they're portraying themselves or the way that others are portraying themselves, is even remotely representative of the actual things they bring to the table and what they can offer. And when those things are perceived to be radically mismatched, this is when some of these issues arise. One of the on-flow implications of this concept is simply that a lot of these situations are resolved over time by the person finding their suitable niche to really prosper and flourish in. Another key concept is many of the people that individuals accuse of being fakes or frauds are not hopeless at everything. In fact, if they are indeed misrepresenting themselves, it's really an exhausting process because they are constantly trying to not be caught out, to not show their hands, so to speak. And so they are good at a lot of things, perhaps not at the thing that you are accusing them of not being good at, but many other things in order to maintain that charade. Another issue here is biases. And so people and disciplines and sectors have implicit biases and expectations about what an expert looks like, what they sound like. And these biases are most definitely not helpful. And some of the time, these accusations of someone being a fake or a fraud are completely misplaced. They're basically just perpetuation of incorrect and out-of-date expectations around what that expert should look like and sound like. The next two concepts really come as a pair. The first concept is simply that a lot of experts, often the ones who are frustrated by someone they perceive as not being an expert, getting an opportunity or talking on a topic that they feel that they're not really qualified to speak of, in a lot of these cases, experts overestimate the amount of expertise that is actually needed to perform the particular role or activity that that person is doing. And so whilst that person may, admittedly, not be a deep expert, a lot of the time it doesn't really matter. On the flip side, a lot of decision makers who go to experts for critical decision-making advice often underestimate how important deep expertise is. Really deep expertise is genuinely quite rare, and just because someone gave a snazzy talk at a conference for 30 minutes doesn't mean they have any deep expertise on the topic they were talking about whatsoever. So do your homework. The context in which a criticism is made and the context of the person who is being criticized is also an important factor. I've seen a lot of very secure tenured professors and senior academics really going to town on criticizing either a startup or someone who's gone out on their own independently. Now, there's no excusing blatant misrepresentation, but you have to understand, of course, that the context for someone whose very day-to-day livelihood depends on them being able to continually convince people of the value of what they have to say or the advice they're going to give is a little bit different perhaps to a tenured academic whose day-to-day livelihood does not depend on this. This would also apply to startups. Startups are naturally going to somewhat oversell and aggressively overpitch what their product can do. This is an understandable byproduct of the entire entrepreneurial system. It doesn't excuse blatantly bad behavior, but there is an important point of difference compared to, say, a secure professor at a university. This one's a really important one. Eloquence does not equal expertise. Eloquence, so can someone get up on stage and speak really fluently and compellingly about a topic, says very little about whether that person is indeed a deep technical expert on the topic at hand. I would actually challenge that anyone who is reasonably fast as a learner, reasonably bright, and is a very eloquent communicator could be put up as a keynote or plenary talk at any commercial conference, and if people were none the wiser, could probably pull off a pretty good job of doing a compelling keynote on just about any topic if they had some preparation time, especially nowadays with the assistance of AI tools. So just because you've seen someone give a wonderfully eloquent, compelling, and appealing talk does not necessarily indicate that they really know any of their stuff at all at a deeper level about a topic. The converse, of course, here is true as well. If someone is a really, really deep expert but has horrendously bad communication skills, a lot of the effectiveness of that expertise will be completely nullified by the fact they just can't communicate it. A lot of the time, the person complaining about how someone they don't regard as an expert got some sort of senior board role or advisory role doesn't take into account the full context. So deep expertise is often important and sometimes it's underestimated. But there are other things that unlock the value of that expertise. In a lot of roles, that person having a very wide network and lots of connections is critical for them to be effective at their role despite their deep technical expertise. They need the networks, the connections in order to introduce people, start new initiatives, and the deep expertise by itself is not going to enable that. And that's why sometimes people who are perhaps not the deepest technical experts in a topic area get those roles because they have all those other capabilities that some of the deep experts do not have themselves. It takes an expert to validate an expert. So this has happened to me many times. It's happened to many other people. You're listening to someone and they sound incredibly awesome and insightful on a topic that you know very little about, but then they start talking about a topic that you do know a lot about, and suddenly they're saying all sorts of stuff that is egregiously wrong. But it's only at that point in time that you realize that perhaps some of the other stuff that you have no way of really validating might not have been so correct either. And so if you're doing your due diligence and vetting experts, bring in another expert to help you do your due diligence, because people can sound very convincing and know very little. One of the phenomena that will come up quite often is that you'll see that someone who you think perhaps is an outright fraud or a fake seems to have a very good and substantial collaborative relationship with some other people that you deeply respect and admire. And this happens all of the time. One of the phenomena at play here is that people inherently have a higher level of trust and perhaps tolerance for people that they've met personally, that they've gotten to know, than they do for absolute strangers. And so sometimes those inexplicable relationships where you go, how is that person working with this other person, are basically a result of social dynamics. There's a related concept here, which is simply when you meet someone or find out about someone and you can't believe that they've got the role that they've got, or you think they're a fake or you think they're a fraud, I can guarantee there's a very large number of people who also think that person is really, really awesome. Now, whether or not the person is actually awesome or great is somewhat a matter of perspective, but nevertheless, that fact is almost always present, that a lot of people will have the opposite impression of that person to you. Initial impressions of someone can be very deceptive. I always urge people to give such impressions some time, to be patient and sort of seeing over time whether your impression of that person does change, because it often will as you perhaps get to know them or further information comes to light. Your initial feelings, your gut feel, are often very strong, but are not always correct. One of the reassurances I tell people when they come to me really frustrated about a situation like this is that truth generally does eventually out. So people who are fundamentally a drain on the system and are really not offering any value, so I'm not talking about the grey fuzzy cases, the people who are really unambiguously not good, the system will generally eventually catch up with them. Their reputation will be established in that way, and eventually everything will even out. Now, sometimes those people do an incredible amount of damage. In the short term, maybe they get opportunities, maybe there's backlash when they don't deliver on those opportunities, but in the medium and long run, a lot of so-called karma really does even out, at least from what I have seen. Not always, don't come at me with all your exceptions, but it does even out in the medium and long term a surprising percentage of the time. In terms of what you can do when you're incredibly frustrated or perhaps even jealous or envious of someone who you feel has gotten some amazing position or award and is just not remotely qualified to get it, first of all, I'd urge patience and a little bit of disengagement. So in the heat of the moment, you may do really silly things that are irreversible from a career perspective. Just remember, this is going to happen continually throughout your career, and if you react strongly and immediately every time it does, you're not going to be happy. You're probably going to do a lot of damage. A lot of these perceptions will change over time, both as you perhaps get to know the person more, but also as you mature and your perspective changes. And so patience and taking things slowly over time is something that is almost always a good idea here. If someone is fundamentally abusive or there is some very clear, very blatant issue going on, definitely call it out or get someone more senior than you to call it out. But a lot of the time it's much fuzzier and much more grey. And a lot of the time your impressions and perspectives on the situations will naturally change over time in both directions. Sometimes you'll get a more negative impression over time, but a lot of the time you'll have a more positive or at least a more neutral perception as time goes on.